I was delighted when I got here to see so many familiar faces and old friends. And that has been one of the real highlights, I think, of all of my teaching, and certainly of being here. Since this conference is devoted to education and the teaching of quilt making, I wanted to make a few comments about education in general. I think we usually assume with education that there's somebody teaching and there's somebody learning, and they're probably in a classroom. But actually the way it works out, we're all teaching all the time and we're all learning all the time, and often in ways of which we're totally unaware. The traditional kind of sentimental image of the mother, sitting straight backed in a chair while she's sitting there well coiffed and reading to her children, who listen reverently to every word, that's an image that appeared to us in many lithographs and paintings. And it, we all know that actually she was going to slouch on the sofa barefoot, and Bobby was going to be pinching his sister, and she'd be sucking her thumb. And the content of that book she was reading was probably the minor part of what she was teaching those children. They were learning a whole lot of other things that had nothing to do with the text. If I'd counted on learning quilting from my mother, I'd have been in real trouble. The only time I heard her use four-letter words coming out of her unglossed lips was when she was at the sewing machine. So, growing up involves asserting one's independence. And of course, we all grow up all our lives. It has nothing to do with our physical maturity. And perhaps that's why so many of our children live lives very different from our own. And it's this separation that provides the basis of a huge amount of American literature. And it's the basis of that assumption that the minister's children are the ones who are going to be the most raucous in class. And it's probably why Margaret Mead, who was brought up by her parents to be given a very liberal exposure to all religions, wished somebody would just tell her what she was, Lutheran or Catholic or whatever. I remember once helping out at a child's birthday party. A woman had invited all these girls over, and she was letting them decorate birthday cakes. And they had these little things filled with frosting on which there were metal caps. And of course, the girls were pretty excited to be decorating these cakes. And one of the girls, in her excitement, in spite of being warned to be very careful, dropped hers on the floor. And when it hit the floor, it mashed, and you knew it would never be used again. And this hostess mother didn't say, "That one made the prettiest flowers," or "That was my favorite one," or "You're a clumsy child." What she said was, "That was my most expensive one." And I think this is the way in which a lot of our education occurs, from the things that are, that slip out or that are said inadvertently. The examples of our behavior are probably much more instructive than what we say. It's like the woman who teaches a class 5 ways to thread a needle, and then before she thread hers, she licks it. Everybody in that group is going to thread their needles by sucking on the thread first, because what they see is so much more direct than what they hear her say. And the lessons that we either learn or try to teach are not often straight line. I sometimes feel that we're like, automobiles. We're all in our cars and we're going fast, but we're on a divided highway and we go past each other, zooming in opposite directions often making no connection. I was at a conference in Vermont, quilt conference, needless to say, walking through the quilt show on a free afternoon, and there were several women walking right ahead of me. They were looking at the quilts and discussing them, and finally one of the women stepped back. She put her hands on her hips and she said, "Well, these aren't even quilts. These are just art." And I thought it was a wonderful comment, and it brought me up kind of short because obviously we don't all have the same goals, and we're sometimes actually working at cross purposes. So what one person might be striving for might be exactly what somebody else wishes to avoid. And it was certainly clear in that case. I once taught a class in professionalism in San Francisco, and I had a group of about 25 women. They were all women. And out of the 25, I had asked them to, first of all, write a one-paragraph resume, and we were going to read those in class and offer suggestions and critiques. And we had to go through 14 before we found one that was positive, because all of them started out with things like, "I have never studied quilting, but," or "since college I've just been a homemaker," or "I have no art training." And they were all apologies, and I realized that's something our society tells us, that it most values jobs that are paid, and that work that produces money seems to have more importance than those that don't produce money. And homemaking and child rearing, having no paychecks, are not very highly valued. So I think it requires strength for any woman to maintain her personal values of what's important in the face of that. And I'm sure it's something that everybody who has ever taught quilting has encountered, because most of our students are women, and they're going to come in with some of this attitude. When I first started teaching, I had decided that writing a book would be a good idea, and I could teach the whole world instead of 20 people at a time. I am now appalled to think I wrote a book when I knew so little about quilts. They were kind of pitifully uninformed about quilt making. I think philosophically they were fine, and they still are, but I knew so little about it. All I knew was that I loved it and I wanted other people to have the same good time that I was having. And it often made me feel like, I thought maybe I knew, well, if they published the book, somebody assumed I knew a little bit more than somebody else, or else they just knew a little less. But it reminded me of that line from Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, where they go, "Can you walk a little faster?" said the whiting to the snail. "There's a porpoise close behind me, and he's stepping on my tail." And it's that nipping at our heels that keeps us moving forward. And it's probably one of the pleasures of teaching, is that you get people asking things and pushing a little and needling you in a way that might be a little bit irritating, but primarily it's stimulating. There's one aspect of quilt making, or of any pursuit, that probably cannot be taught. And it was on a recent visit in Baltimore to the Museum of Visionary Art that I was most aware of it. The exhibits there were the work of people who had no interest in selling or showing or publishing or recognition, or of having an agent or a gallery, a following, or of teaching a class. They worked out of passion, and that single-minded aspect of their work was what made their work so powerful. Sometimes the work was superb for its color or its style or its detail or its craftsmanship. It's often not. And that single-minded vision was so overwhelming that everything else about the work paled. It was probably one of the most exciting days I've ever spent in a museum. And passion, I think, is something we can see in other people, but I don't know that it can be taught except perhaps by example. It's probably a little related to obsession, which is easier for most of us to identify with about 2 in the morning when you're still up sewing. But it drives a person in spite of all obstacles. The lack of resources doesn't slow it down. In fact, a lack of resources tends to feed it more than it deprives it. The carvings of the Inuits, the ledger drawings of the American Indians, the Watts Towers, hobo art, these are all arts that are created under extraordinary circumstances. And the power of their work results, I think, in part from that very limitation, which might seem a restriction, and that restriction might come from one's culture, or the time, or from materials, or funds, but some of it is derived from the human drive to create in spite of whatever the circumstances. Surely it was passion that led pioneer women to create some of the world's most extraordinary quilts in the face of need and want and sometimes extreme poverty. Deprivation did not deter the quilters of Appalachia or those of Gee's Bend. Stunning quilts were made by women of means, too, of course, but perhaps they experienced a different kind of poverty. Ruth Finley stated that in her book, The Old Patchwork Quilts, suggested that up until the 1870s or 1880s, all of a woman's creative talents were channeled into quilt making. And then after that, women's colleges opened and many universities were open to women. And then that talent could be given its potential growth in some other area. It could flower elsewhere. But this was, of course, a great thing for women, probably not a great thing for quilt making. But today, students deliberately choose quilt making. It's one of the myriad choices and typically indicates that students are highly motivated. They may want to learn for a variety of reasons, but they're in a class because they choose to be. And no one has illusions that quilting is going to bring them fame, glory, riches, or community prestige. I have 3 favorite examples of teaching that were crucial to me, that taught me a lot about quilt making and about what was valuable. I grew up during the Depression, and I came home from school one day. My mother was sorting socks from the laundry, and I was very surprised to see her drop an occasional sock into the wastebasket because, of course, at that time you mended them, you didn't throw them out. She did set some of the odd ones aside, knowing that they could be paired with other odd ones in the way that the local old maids were paired off with any bachelors who were around. But when I looked at her, she said, "Life is too short to spend any of it darning socks." And that pretty much taught me what I needed to know about making choices. And then another time she was taking the neighborhood kids out to the river to collect the first pussy willows of the spring. And we saw Mrs. Johnson next door, who was out cleaning or doing her spring cleaning. And she had those, those wire things that are very decorative and people now hang them on their walls. She was using those to beat her carpets. And my mother invited her to join us, but she declined, and my mother said, you know, she said, everybody has to be best at something, and we'll let Mrs. Johnson have the cleanest house in town. And then the third thing that was helpful to me was seeing her one time doing some ironing. And she said to me quite seriously, she said, you know, Jean, if you never learn to iron a shirt really well, nobody is ever going to expect you to iron a shirt really well. And which pretty much taught me what I needed to know about how we create our own expectations. So perhaps my own quilting came about not because someone taught me to sew, but rather from helping me to form the values that let me pursue whatever were my own interests. And how do those interests arise? They come from exposure, whether it's in a school, in a museum, at home, in books, you know, on television, whatever. The exposure is crucial. It allows us to build on whatever has already been done. If we're really good parents, our children are going to grow up and leave. Well, actually, I guess if we weren't good parents, they might leave too. But if we're good, they'll come back. And good teachers find that their students are the same way. A good student is going to fly off on her own, and holding on to them is like, you know, trying to grasp water. The tighter you try to hold on, the less you can keep hold. And then I think in teaching, generally, teaching a technique is very simple. It's very easy to do. Creating an environment for potential growth is much more difficult. It's not a matter of outpouring from the teacher to the student. It is a matter of realizing the student's potential and helping the student to respond to it. So teaching is not putting into a student, it's only drawing out from the student whatever is there. Teaching is also renewing. You take all the experiences you've had, your knowledge, your training, your understanding, and in teaching you try to give it away. You know, you walk into a class and you'd like to give every bit of it to the students, and then something happens, there's no getting rid of it. The more you try giving it away, the more it stays with you. The things we know are often, you know, they're often kind of floating or they're nebulous. So what we want to share, when we want to share that knowledge, we have to put it into some other form. We have to state it verbally, or write out a handout sheet, or demonstrate it, or produce examples, or identify references. And that process makes the information more concrete. It reinforces it. I guess you have reinforced concrete then, don't you? So what happens is that we possess that information in a new way. We're more secure about it than we were before. Quilters who pride themselves on being self-taught always surprise me. None of us is self-taught unless we grew up in a total vacuum. You'd have to be nearly brain dead not to learn from the hundreds of sources that surround us constantly. Given time and effort, techniques are something any of us can figure out. You know, eventually we can figure out how to do just about any of it. But the concept of quilt making is a gift from other generations, from past centuries. And anyone keen on quilting today has learned from many, many other sources. In working with students, we create an environment that accomplishes our goals. And I've had There are three that I can identify that I consciously try to use in my own teaching. The first one is validation. Most students need to be assured that wherever they are, it's okay, and it's the perfect starting point. It also happens to be the only starting point. It's the only place from which you can begin. But we all have to build on whatever it is we've got. And I think validation offers encouragement. Everyone needs it. It's not a need that we outgrow at a certain age or at a certain level of accomplishment. Everybody needs it. When I started teaching in the 60s, some of you probably weren't born yet, there were no organizations or venues for classes. I taught a class in my home, and at the end of a 6 or 8 week class, we would have an exhibit, and we would hang things, from the kitchen to the bathroom and every space in between. And the classes consisted primarily of, probably half and half professional women, nurses and doctors and librarians, and then also homemakers and the mothers of small children. And this exhibit was not a gallery installation. When I ran out of wall space, I put things over the backs of chairs or laid them out on a coffee table. It didn't matter, and it sounds pretty hokey by today's standards, but nevertheless, it validated their work, and it validated them in the eyes of family and friends that they brought with them. So I think some activity is always needed that validates the students. Doesn't matter if that's verbal, just through acknowledgement, or visual through exhibition, or whatever works, any way, any means you find. A second thing I found important was relevance. Work must be meaningful in terms of each student's life. The relevance might be historical, cultural, social, literary, family, community-centered, whatever, but it must be relevant to the student's life if it's going to maintain importance. I heard a wonderful interview one night on television. Charlie Rose was interviewing Cokie Roberts, two of my favorites, and at one point Rose asked his guest, he said, "What is it that qualifies you to be a political analyst?" And Cokie Roberts said, "Well, I've been around 2-year-olds." And Charlie Rose kind of sat back and she said, "I've listened to some of these presidential debates, and I just want to say, I don't care who started it, sit down and shut up." And then she said, "That goes for Congress too." And I realized that was the first time I had ever heard a politically prominent woman credit child rearing with giving her insight into adult behavior. And it was wonderful. And I'm sure there were other people all over the country that were applauding her comments. She made child rearing relevant to political life, and she helped us see the connection between child rearing and what we were doing with our own lives. I had a friend who lived in a planned community in Northern California, and he was a woodworker, and he did beautiful turned wood pieces. And some of the work was just exquisite, and he had tried for years to get the architectural magazines to come and look at his work. And they never showed up, but one day there was a big storm, and this huge tree fell over into his driveway. So the only way he could get out was if he cut that tree apart and hauled off the wood. And he got out his chainsaw, and he was muttering. He was pretty upset that this whole thing was taking him away from his work with wood. When he looked down and realized, I'm working with wood. And suddenly what had been a mundane job became relevant. He just saw it in a totally different way. So he started arranging the firewood that he cut. And he would use the little end cuts of the wood. I mean, they were log-like things, but he stacked them to create patterns and designs out of those round end cuts. And it resulted in a large sculpture that ran along one edge of his house and across the front. His neighbors were so impressed with this, they commissioned him to arrange their indoor firewood storage for special Christmas parties. And then the Sea Ranch office commissioned him to do a huge sculpture that ran all along the entry driveway. Suddenly his phone was ringing off the hook. So he was getting the attention for his work, and he said it all came about because of making this connection between what we think of as ordinary in our lives that becomes the crucial element in the work we're doing. I think I had a kind of similar epiphany one time in a Goodwill store. I had always dismissed my grandmother's doilies as, something from another era, and if you weren't using antimacassar, you hardly needed one. But when I held one up to the light to look at it, I realized it had all the elements of design were there. There was repetition and scale and linear qualities. All the elements were embodied in that little piece of work. And I realized the reason my grandmother had, I think I counted them once, she had 70 of them in a drawer in her living room. She had 3 pieces of furniture in her living room, which meant she could use, six or 9 of them. So she wasn't making them to be functional. I think she had found a way that was socially acceptable for her to do something that was even minimally creative, and it possessed her. I once saw an exhibit in San Francisco at the Museum of Science in which they talked about various individuals and what had inspired their work. One of the people they featured was John Cage, and they talked about something he had said, in which he said in growing up he never heard classical music. What he heard were the sounds of New York City, cars crashing, garbage cans banging around, all of those noises, breaking glass, and cars hitting one another. So in his own music, that's what he used. That was the music of his childhood. So, he might have used rasps on metal and the sounds of tools running, because that was the kind of sound he related to. The exhibit also featured Judy Chicago and the 2 classes she had taken that had merged when she worked on the dinner party. One was a class in China painting, and the other was a class in automotive painting, which she said were essentially the same thing. One was small and the other was big. They also referred to, I think, a geologist who took all the information that had been available to a geologist for years, and he put it together in a different way so that he developed from that the theory of plate tectonics. So it was, it was from whatever was available, from what often seems common. Most recently I saw, well, probably a lot of you saw it, if you watched the Oscars, you saw that dance group, and they do that one incredible ad, where the bodies dance and suddenly form this silhouette of an automobile. And they had done another one of, I think, for The Devil Wears Prada, of a high-heeled shoe. Now, the human body has not changed. These dancers weren't doing something that the body, that was new to the human body. Somebody just saw them in a different way, connected them in a different way, and put them together or assembled in a way they hadn't been assembled before. So again, it's taking what we already know and that we see around us. Early in my own teaching and quilt making, I signed up for a class with Constance Howard, and it was at a yarn depot in San Francisco. The class was held in an unused room that had broken window blinds at the windows. Tables and chairs were all askew. There was inadequate heating, and Constance spent a lot of time struggling with a slip strap or something that was annoying her. And her slides needed a lot of help. And I thought it looked kind of hopeless. But once she started talking, none of that mattered in any way at all. We willingly, sat like this to view her slides. And we were all so inspired by her. So I guess if you're a really exceptional teacher, you can ignore all of the so-called rules, those things that have to do with the physical environment in which we're teaching. But most of us cannot. But that was a great reminder to me about what was really important. Not the mechanics, which can be helpful and which can change the comfort level, but the teacher's ability to encourage and to inspire and fire the student's interests. But it doesn't matter how dedicated or caring a teacher is, if the student doesn't care, there isn't going to be any learning going on. And validation and relevance, I think, give the students reasons to care. And then a third element, which is probably crucial, at least it is for me, it's one I rely on a lot, because it creates community within a group, and that is humor. It works for me in my teaching, and it's probably most important in groups where a real commitment to the work has not yet gelled. If somebody's really committed, nothing else matters. They're going to work, whether they're in your class or not. But those who are tentative or just kind of feeling their way will find that humor can be a very, very good way to bond them together. Humor lets us make new connections, and laughter makes people receptive. So it gives them a new way to see things. This reminds me of something I read that Samuel Johnson once said. He was talking about writing, but I think it applies to any creative work. He said, writing is like a second marriage. It is the triumph of hope over experience. And I thought what was so funny about it for me was because he's connecting these things in a totally different way from any I'd have thought of. And then one time at a quilt conference, Dr. John O'Donnell was talking. He's a folklorist, and he was talking about the kinds of things that bond groups together. And he had seen a bumper sticker in the parking lot at that conference. And the bumping sticker said, "Quilters do it in the ditch." And he said that was a perfect example of what he was talking about, because there's a second meaning in it, and only other quilters know what you're talking about. And as trivial as that might seem, it is one of those bonding things that happens within groups. Early on in my teaching, something happened in a class that I found really helpful, and it kind of highlighted the importance of humor. I was teaching a class for University Extension, so we were meeting on a Saturday, and it was fairly early in the morning. And as a means of introducing the students, I asked them to describe to the rest what they had to do to be there for class at 9 o'clock in the morning. And one of the women in the class, I thought at the time she was one of the older women, she might have been, 45. She said, "Well, I got breakfast for the family, and I arranged for someone to take the dog to the vet. I packed some lunches, and I removed the dinner stuff from the freezer and started a load of laundry, and then I was collecting my class materials when my mother-in-law dropped by. And she said she was wearing a nice coat, so she was careful not to sit down on one of the kitchen chairs. And then she said, "You know, Louise, over at your sister-in-law's, you could just eat off the floor." And she said, I responded to her by saying, "You can eat off the floor here too. I see some Cheerios and some raisins." And that comment did it. Her humor suggested a new way of dealing with frustrations, and it changed the whole class. It gave them a common bond, and I learned something really important for me, and that was that humor was essential, because anyone learns more readily when they're laughing. Bonding can occur through any shared experience. I'm sure each of us has attended a conference where we felt like everybody else there had her life together, and you were the only one who was pulling all this luggage with you. You had all this baggage, the things you were trying to deal with in your personal life or your professional life or whatever. Anyway, we haul it all off to this conference with us. And I was reminding a class about this, and I left an opening for anyone who wanted to share something related to it. And several people started telling their stories, and everything in the class changed. Barriers dropped, pretensions melted away, and instead of protecting themselves, people opened up, and it was a totally different class from that moment on. Finally, I wanted to mention two examples of how visuals and humor can be vehicles for education. We had a quilt exhibit in California from the State Quilt Search. And included in that show was an embroidered redwork quilt. And it had been made many, many years earlier by a woman who was offering advice to her grandchildren. I'm sure if she had offered the advice verbally, it would have been, and probably rightly so, ignored. But she put it into this quilt, and everyone who walked past that quilt stopped and read some of those bits of advice or those admonitions. Now, I'm sure that woman found the most effective way to voice her opinions, and they were still being heard 80 years later. I have other strong opinions, I guess, some of them about parenting, and my outlook for that has been to do some humorous writing about them. I feel that by making my point in a humorous way, I can sometimes be more effective. Now, I do want to apologize to Stuart and tell him that I really do know what real poetry is, but these allow me an amusing way to say something I think is important. The first one's about a little boy. I call these the Comeuppance Poems. Lots and lots of big balloons were selling at the fair, and Billy wanted one because they stayed up in the air. And when his mother bought him one, he only wanted more. He cried and screamed and stamped his feet until she'd bought him 4. And when she'd bought him 6, "That's all you get," she said. He laid down on the grass and kicked until his face grew red. And when he got his 10th balloon and thought he'd been quite clever, the big balloons just picked him up and flew away forever. And then, not wanting to be sexist, I also brought one about a little girl. I once knew a little girl who would not eat her dinner, and every time she wouldn't eat, she grew a little thinner. And then one day she stoutly said, "I will not eat my lunch. I don't want milk or plum or bread or plums or anything to munch. I won't eat peas, I don't want corn. You can't make me eat meat. You don't have one thing in this house that I would like to eat. And all she ate was bubble gum, candy bars and sweets, sugar babies, lemon balls, and sticky caramel treats, chocolates and jelly beans and chewy gummy bears, Tootsie Rolls, candy corn, and fudge marshmallow squares. She got so full of sugar she was 1 cup to the cup that hummingbirds all flocked around and sucked that girl right up. And then finally, one last short one just to show you that adults are not immune. This is about a gardener. David Darden had a garden, sprayed it every day, killed the weeds, destroyed their seeds, and kept the bugs away. Insecticides, pesticides, and sprays for worms and toads, bait for bugs, for snails and slugs, and stuff for nematodes. David Darden's perfect garden gave him joy and pride, breathed that spray until one day collapsed, laid down and died. Not everyone will always agree, with what you offer visually or through humor, but almost everyone hears it. And as you saw in the slides that Michael was showing, I often use a kind of cartoon format, especially in some of the more political quilts, because I find that almost everyone will stop and look at something that looks like a funny paper. So I find I can express my opinion and often reach an audience where that contact might otherwise be confrontational. So in that way, people who might not listen to me still hear what I have to say. I think teaching in and of itself is a learning experience. It's a process. For some, it's a gift. For others, it comes from effort and study and practice. But for our students, it is our caring, our dedication, and our passion that makes the difference. And if we spend a lifetime at it, we had better also enjoy it. Thank you.